el doctor Flusberg ha trabajado mucho en esos temas y bueno, yo creo que vamos a aprender mucho sobre metáforas.
Gracias. Buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias por la invitación a participar en este taller. Aprecio la oportunidad para ustedes, pero solo hablo un poquito de español y ahora hablo en inglés. And if you need me to slow down or you have questions, please let me know. I will do my best. And I've tried to put some of the key points on the slides. Hopefully it makes it easier. But sometimes I speak muy rápido, and if that happens, just let me know. So I'm speaking today and tomorrow, and the talks are related. And so maybe tomorrow's more interesting, more newsworthy, provocative stuff. But I think the topic of today is really important before doing the kinds of investigations I'm going to talk about tomorrow. And I'll explain everything I mean as I go. So one thing that I'm really interested in is the major problems that are happening in the world, all over the world. We have huge issues. There's violent conflicts, climate change, political polarization, all sorts of major issues. But I'm a cognitive scientist. I'm not a politician. I'm not an activist. I can't solve those. So I'm not here to talk about how to solve the problems, unfortunately. But what I do think a lot about is how do people conceptualize these issues. And I really want to understand how do people think about these major issues and how can maybe, one day if we can use that understanding to help work towards better solutions. And so the way I address this in a lot of my research is to look at how people communicate, how people talk about big issues. And I'm not the first person to point this out, but when people talk about complex, big, major, important issues in society, they use metaphors. Metaphors are pervasive in this discourse. So we say things, and I'm going to use examples for obvious reasons that are in English and mostly from the United States. I will say a little bit about Spanish as we go, but to the extent that I know Spanish. So we say things like, how do we get the economy back on track? That's been a major talking point in the wake of the pandemic with economic issues, difficulties all over the world. But the economy is not literally a train that has fallen off the track. It's only metaphorically a train that's we say things like, how can we fix our broken political systems? It's the metaphors like it's a machine, it's a mechanism that can be broken and fixed. What can we do about the global epidemic of hate? So we've seen, violence erupts in the Middle East in the last couple of weeks and a lot of hatred between people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds. And people use the metaphor of an epidemic or a pandemic to talk about these disagreements. Another very popular metaphor is things like, are we losing the race against global warming? As if there was some kind of race that we have to run and we can lose it, and that's not good. And then another question is, have we won the war against COVID-19? The discussions of COVID-19 utilize this war metaphor. And one of the things that I've written a lot about is how, at least in the American context, war metaphors are extremely pervasive. So for example, if you go online and you search on like Amazon and you search for a book, War on Blank, most of them are not about a literal war. There's like World War II, but here's just ones I found that have been published in the last few years. There's a war on drugs, there's a war on guns, but there's also a war on cops. There's a war against violence. Don't worry, there's also a war against women. There's a war on sex, just in general. There's a war on science, which is no good. There's a war on sound. I don't know what this one's about. There's a war on noise. There's a war on truth. And of course, there's metaphor wars. So this war metaphor is extremely common. I have a lot more to say about this metaphor as we go, but I'm introducing the ideas slowly. Now, for these metaphors, they don't just use the word war. This isn't just like X is war, like a nominal metaphor. You just say it, label it. We use metaphors more systematically, where we borrow all the words and phrases from one domain to talk about another. So we talk about this as that metaphors are systematic. So for example, when the COVID-19 pandemic started, a lot of leaders in the United States, but also around the world, used word metaphors to talk about the pandemic. So Andrew Cuomo was the governor of my state of New York in the beginning of COVID-19. He later had to resign because of a sexual harassment scandal, but that's a different story. So here's him at the beginning of the pandemic, and he said, the soldiers in this fight are our healthcare professionals. It's the doctors, it's the nurses, it's the people who are working in the hospitals, it's the aides. They are the soldiers who are fighting the battle for us. So he's using this war metaphor very systematically to map the different interested parties. You know, here the frontline soldiers, those are the healthcare professionals, the people in the hospitals. And the entire, all of us working together are trying to defeat this enemy of COVID-19. This war metaphor was used not just in English, but it's used around the world. Since I have written some stuff about war metaphors, every paper that's about war metaphors now gets sent to me to review. So I've reviewed papers from Latin America, from China, Japan, the Middle East, all over. So here's one paper that was published by some Peruvian academics, and they were looking at headlines, obviously in Spanish in Peru. And so I took this from their article, which is quite interesting. They're just analyzing the metaphor in these newspaper articles and people talking in news. And so la epidemia es una invasión, invasion. Nadie puede ganar solo esta guerra, solo unidos venceremos al virus. And I apologize for my accent. Estamos en guerra y no actuar es traición a la patria. So I like this one's really extending the metaphor, right? It is treason if we don't act, right? And you can see that this metaphor is being used quite systematically and in novel ways. And la emergencia sanitaria es una batalla, una lucha, un combate. And these are just a small example. You saw these all over the world. So metaphors are pervasive in discussions of complex and abstract issues. They're used systematically. And in my research, this is the starting point for the questions that I like to investigate. And as you'll see, I'm trained as an experimental cognitive psychologist originally. So a lot of my work is designing and running experiments to try to address the following questions. So why are metaphors so common in this public discourse? And really, why are certain metaphors? Why is the war metaphor in particular so common? Do these metaphors reflect underlying thoughts and attitudes? So when someone's using a metaphor, or they're saying, that's the metaphor, I like that one. Is that telling us something about their underlying cognition, how they're actually thinking or feeling about the issue? Maybe that seems obvious. Often it is, but not always, and I'll talk about that today. And then one really thing I'm interested in is how can we tell? What are the methods we can use? And today I'm going to talk about a few of those. So these are really the questions I'm going to address today, especially the second one. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about, as I said earlier, what might be the most interesting part of this for some of you, which is, okay, how do these metaphors actually impact reasoning and decision making? So really, the audience for our politicians and journalists using these metaphors, that's what we're reading in the newspaper, that's what we're seeing on social media, that's what we're seeing in the news. How does that actually affect our thinking and feeling? And so that's what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. But what I want to argue for today is that before we get to that question, we need to first understand really what metaphors mean. Do they actually reflect how people think? Because I think you can't go about most effectively testing how a metaphor is shaping people's thinking until you know what that metaphor actually reflects about their thinking. So that's the argument I want to make today. If that doesn't make sense now, hopefully it will by you. So a lot of my investigation on this issue and all of these questions began when I was in university and I read Metaphors We Live by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. This book was very influential. And they argued that metaphor is not just a matter of language, that is, of mere words. This is literally the first page of the book. On the contrary, they say human thought processes are largely metaphorical. The human conceptual system is metaphorically structured and defined. And this is the whole point of their book and a lot of George Lakoff's work in the last 40 years or so, is making this strong argument that really when people think, especially when they think about abstract complex issues, these kinds of things I'm talking about, pandemics and climate change. What they do is they use their knowledge from, I guess, a more familiar and simple domain, one that they have often embodied, experience with in their real life, and they use that structure of those concepts to reason about these more abstract issues. Now, the way they make this argument is by analyzing language. So this book is all about analyzing English. In the intervening years, cognitive linguists have done similar projects in many, many, many languages. And so they point out, for example, you look at how English speakers talk about arguments, they also use the word metaphor. So in English, we say things like, those claims that you made are indefensible. Maybe you think that about already what I've said in this talk. I will attack every weak point in your argument, which you're all welcome to do. My criticisms are right on target. I can shoot down all your counter arguments and demolish your main defenses, and using this strategy, I'll wipe out your position. So these are all kind of words and phrases, ideas from the domain of word that are mapped onto the domain of argumentation. And so just a terminology, people talk about what argument and war are a little bit differently. In the field, I use the same terms as Lakoff and Johnson. So for me, arguments are the target domain. That's what I'm talking about or what I'm thinking about. And wars are the source. So I just put that here because I'm going to use this term as we go. And so Lakoff and Johnson make this point that these aren't just linguistic metaphors. They're not just metaphors in the language. They are conceptual metaphors. They reflect how people actually think. So people are actually thinking about arguments as wars. And so they talk about this concept of metaphorical entailments. That's the characteristics of the source domain, war, that's projected onto the target. Now, not every element of war is projected onto arguments. So, for example, in wars, you need like medics on hand to heal the injured soldiers. That's not really mapped onto arguments, although maybe if you're creative, it would be. So, for example, I never had seen the treason mapping before I saw that the Spanish example from Peru that, if we don't combat, if we're not all in on fighting COVID, that's treason. If we don't act, it's treason. So you can extend these things. But anyway, their point in the book is that they call it metaphors we live by because these entailments license certain inferences. They structure how we behave in these domains. So what do I mean by that? Well, we can use different metaphors for talking about arguments. And what Lakoff and Johnson say is we think about them differently as a result. So because we talk about arguments as words, the goal of the argument comes from the goal. You have to strategize, you have to win, you defeat your opponent, you destroy their position. And Lakoff and Johnson say that's just how we think about wars. But that's not, that's how we think about arguments. That's not because arguments are inherently words. That's because we apply this metaphor. We could, for example, and they use this example in their book, we could think about arguments as a dance, right? Where there's two partners and they're performing and it's balanced and it has some, it's aesthetically pleasing and you have to enjoy the technique. And maybe there's a history of this in some cultures, like at, I know at Oxford University, they would put on these debates and a lot of it was aesthetic. It was the rhetoric you used and everyone's laughing and smiling, even though they're having an argument. But in the United States, no. Like you win, and with I always listen. So I learned it's not a dance, it's a war, and I have already lost. I surrender. So we could also, apply another metaphor. That's the beauty of having an abstract domain like arguments. Arguments have structure, but we give it a structure through this metaphorical mapping of entailment. So if an argument is a journey, maybe the goal is to move closer to a specific destination. Maybe the real goal is to meet in the middle with others who are coming from another place, right? Embody that in your mind. It'd be nice if arguments were like this. Imagine if politics were more like journeys instead of battles between the two opposing sides. So this is the point of the book. It influenced me a lot. But one thing that I thought a lot about in my mind is, okay, are we sure people are actually using these entailments to think? Like when you're using this arguments are war metaphor? Are you really thinking about argument as a war? Does it really reflect your underlying thought processes? And the issue is that in their book, their only evidence for this is linguistic analysis and their intuitions. You know, I think about the arguments I've had, I look at how English speakers talk about arguments. Oh, this is obvious. And it does seem very intuitive to me too. It seems so obvious, and that the book was so influential. And then I started reading critics of Lakoff and Johnson. And one of the main critiques is, well, if your only evidence, right, you're saying people think about arguments as words. People think about every topic as metaphors. What's your evidence? Well, that's how they talk about it. Well, but you're using a linguistic evidence to talk about their underlying conceptual processing. That's not necessarily the same thing. We might use lots of words and phrases without it, just because that's the normative expression. We've heard other people say it. We might not be thinking about it that way at all. And in fact, people's intuitions are often unreliable. So there's experiments showing that you can you give people the definition of some metaphor and they say, oh, yeah, that's it. And then you give another group a different explanation of the metaphor and they say, yeah, that's it. And it's the moment you create whatever meaning they want out of whatever information you give them. So our intuitions aren't always reliable. There are other methods. So for example, in some well-known studies, you'll ask people about the source domain. So I'll say, okay, tell me some properties of wars, and they list everything, and you say, okay, so this is people's concept of war. So if they're using that metaphor of an argument is war, or the pandemic is war, or whatever is war, this is their concept that they're using. But again, there's issues with that because the meanings of some terms can vary in different contexts. So when I ask you about just in general, you might list some synonyms or explanations, but then when I say, you know, tell me about when you were warring with your spouse over what to make for dinner. Well, now the word war brings to mind different ideas in that context, right? The meanings of words are contextual. I'm going to show evidence for this in a minute, so you don't have to just take my word for it. That's one of the things I want to talk about in the next hours. So today, I want to dive deep into this, and I want to talk about some of the methods that my collaborators and I have developed and used to try to more carefully measure and assess whether the metaphors that people use in everyday language or that they endorse, they say, yes, I like that metaphor, arguments or words, whether that actually reflects how they're thinking and how can we know it. So this is a couple of ways of thinking about this. Do metaphors mean what we intuitively think they mean? So if I give you a metaphor and I say, do you like this metaphor? And you said, yes. Do I know something about your thinking because I have my own intuition about what it means? Well, I'm going to ask if we can actually measure that. And so another way to focus this is there like a more empirical method for mapping these metaphorical entailments, where I don't just rely on my own intuition. I have some other way of measuring these entailments. And so what I'm doing today is putting together some of the different ways we've explored this. And then tomorrow I'm going to follow up and with some of these very same studies I'm showing you today and saying, okay, once we do these things, now we can make more principled predictions about how people will respond when they're exposed to these metaphors. All right. So here are the three methods I want to talk about today. So if you use a metaphor, if I ask you like which metaphor you like or prefer or you think is correct, that should predict something else I can measure about your behavior. And so in kind of experimental methodology, we call this convergent validity, right? So if I come up with a new measure of some personality traits, I'm a researcher who's interested, okay, I'm interested in how, do people really like cleanliness? So I come up with a questionnaire that's like the cleanliness questionnaire. Well, that should have convergent validity with other measures that I think tap into the same thing. So, people who score high on the personality dimension of conscientiousness, those are people who tend to have more organized work environments. They should also score higher on my measure of cleanliness. That makes sense. And similarly, different metaphors, if I ask you to reflect on a metaphor, I should be able to measure in some way that brings to mind like distinct and coherent and unique clusters of attributes or thoughts compared to other metaphors. So again, I'm taking this methodology from like personality psychology. So in personality psychology, you ask people to rate themselves or other people on like 100 traits. You know, is this person clean? Are they outgoing? Are they social? Are they this? Are they that? And then they do some factor analysis or a way to kind of reduce the responses on those to a set of underlying factors that are uniquely associated with different personality traits. So I'll explain more. And then finally, for some metaphors, and especially I'm going to argue conventional metaphors like argument is war that are just built into the language that we all, when I learned English, I learned those metaphors. We should be able to use some implicit measures like reaction times. And that should, if we're really thinking in terms of that metaphor, the implicit measure should reflect that kind of metaphor congruent or incongruent processing. So this is all very vague right now, but I'm going to give you an example of 3 different experiments, one each that exemplifies these approaches. So I'm going to start. So a lot of my research is influenced by, like I said before, the news. For better or for worse, for my own mental health. I read a lot of like social media, and I watch cable news, and it's but it's very interesting if you want to know how people communicate and think about these topics. So in the United States, over the last 20 or 30 years or so, there's been a lot of interest in sort of attitudes about law enforcement and the attitudes that is embodied by law enforcement themselves. And one of the metaphors that came to dominate the discourse of the police in the United States is this idea of a warrior or a soldier. That just like we send soldiers out to war against other countries, the police are warriors and they have to have a warrior-soldier mindset. And so here are examples. The United States military, if you didn't know, has a lot of money. We give a lot of money to the military. They can't spend it all. So what do? They sell the excess gear to local police departments. So now you have police departments in various small towns across the country that have military gear. And if you go on like Facebook, you go to police areas on Facebook, and this idea, you see these police officers in full tactical gear, and they use this warrior metaphor. And it sometimes, maybe this is good, maybe this is the same in other countries, but sometimes it gets a little strange, like when this town of Keene, New Hampshire, which only has a few thousand residents, bought a tank from the United States military. There's like almost no violent crime in this town. So you can see this is like what they see they're living by this metaphor that we are warriors, we are soldiers. Now, a number of years ago, when Barack Obama was president, there had been some violent interactions between the police and especially citizens, innocent civilians, especially people, Black men. There's obviously, you've probably heard of a lot of these cases. George Floyd is the most famous one from a few years ago. But this has been happening for a while. That wasn't the first time. And so in 2015, Barack Obama commissioned this task force on 21st century policing. And it had this very memorable line. It said, law enforcement culture should embrace a guardian rather than a warrior mindset. It didn't have the colors I added. So just to build trust and legitimacy both within agencies and within the public. So you see there's this idea that's very intuitive that, okay, the police, this warrior metaphor, they could adopt a different one, the guardian. There's an assumption that perfectly makes sense. And if you endorse a guardian metaphor, you should be more protective, right? So that's the idea. And there was a lot of debate. So these are all real articles. For the warrior versus guardian mindset, you're the ones who created it. These are all written from the perspective of police or law enforcement. Warriors versus guardian, is this a scientific shift or just semantics, right? Is this just BS words? It doesn't actually change anything. And then, warrior versus guardian. So this became a big debate. And so there's an intuitive idea here, right? So we can do the kind of conceptual mapping that Lakoff and Johnson would do, and that clearly the Obama administration was doing, right? Guardian metaphor emphasizes protection, service, right? That the police are there to protect others. It kind of de-emphasizes the fighting part, the warrior. Whereas the metaphor emphasizes you are fighting criminals. You are a soldier. It's aggressive. And so the idea is, guardian, not only would it be lower the violence between police and civilians if the law enforcement adopted this metaphor, but maybe people in the public would have better attitudes towards the police if this guardian metaphor were out there in the world rather than the warrior. And so, along with Paul Thibodeau and Latoya Crowe, we basically wanted to test this. So there's an empirical prediction. So this is kind of the next step. This maybe seems simple, but in this metaphor research, people weren't doing this kind of thing. So we really wanted to say, okay, well, if the guardian metaphor, really is associated with more positive kind of protective attitudes, then we should be able to measure your attitudes towards the police and which metaphor you think best describes the police. And if you think the guardian metaphor is what best describes the police, you should have more positive attitudes towards the police. Whereas if you think the warrior metaphor best describes the police, you should have more negative attitudes. I want to say maybe that's intuitive and obvious, but maybe it's not, because warriors can be good. In sports in the United States, you want your players to be a warrior. It's good if the player is a warrior. Warriors on my team, right? It's great. So it's actually not at all, it wasn't at all obvious to us that the guardian metaphor is necessarily better. Maybe you think guardian, that sounds weak. I don't want my police officers to be weak. So is it really the case that people have more positive attitudes, there's better relations with the public if they use this guardian metaphor? So we tested this very simply. We created this attitudes towards policing scale. We made a mistake, which is that other people had already created these scales, but we didn't find those in time. So we made our own. It's very simple, and it's actually similar to others. So we just asked 8 questions. Most of them are ratings or just choosing one description or another. So it's things like police have a very easy job, a very difficult job. The idea there is that if you think their job is difficult, you actually have more positive attitudes. You think they're doing well. Police officers are either 1, low rating, very ineffective, or very effective at maintaining law and order. How would you describe the fairness of the criminal justice system? And so on. And you can combine people's responses to these and get this one number that represents their attitudes towards the police. Higher number means more positive attitudes. And I threw in this measure of internal reliability from that sample, and it was comparable to other measures. So it's a reliable measure. And then all we did was a really simple study. So first, we just got people's lexical association. So this is what other people had done. So we just said, forget about metaphors for a second. What are some qualities of a guardian? And then you just list. And then what are some qualities of a warrior? And they answered that question after they did the policing question. That'll be important. And then we just said, okay, which metaphor do you think better describes policing in the US today? Guardian or warrior? And then we said, oh, and also which metaphor do you think better describes the ideal? And we asked the 2 questions because we wanted to make sure for question 1 that they were giving their belief about what the police are now, not what they wish they were. And so just for your reference, about 60% of people, I think, said, about 60% of people said that police are actually guardians, and 40% said they're actually warriors right now. The answer to question 1. And about 85% or something, a vast majority said they should be guardians, but everyone says about 15% said they should be warriors. And those people, if you look at their demographics, they're more likely to be white and conservative and male. And so women and people who are ethnic minorities and people who are more liberal or progressive were more likely to say they should be guardian. Okay, anyway, we also asked another set of people just these descriptions of guardian and warrior. And this was the idea I raised earlier, that the meaning of a term might differ based on the context. So the people who just answered that question, that was the neutral context. They signed on to our experiment. We recruited all these participants over the internet, and they just got, what are qualities of a guardian? What are qualities of a warrior? Nothing about police at all. The rest of the participants in the main task, they had just answered these questions about the police. So we activated this policing context. And then we said the same thing. What are qualities of a guardian? What are qualities of a warrior? And so if you look at the most frequent words that were used to describe them, and in the parentheses is the number of people who said it. In the neutral context, what you can see is the words are overwhelmingly positive for both guardians and warriors. People have positive associations. Guardians are caring, protecting, loving, kind, strong. Warriors are strong, brave, fearless, tough, they fight. The warrior, we used this analysis tool called the Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, LIWC, and it measures, for each word, it can measure like how positive is the valence and how negative. It gives you both of those. And you find that they're both pretty positive, warriors a little bit more negative. The participants first got the questions about the policing context, and here are their words. And what you can see is pretty similar, but with some more negative words started going towards the top, like aggressive and violent have a more negative valence, more negative associations. And so what we did was we basically, for each word, we put it into this program, and it's this normed number. How positive is it and how negative is it? And you can put it on a graph like this. And basically, in the neutral context, what you can see is more positive than negative for both guardians and warriors. Warrior was actually a little bit slightly more positive. I don't think that was significantly different, but also had a slightly more negative connotation. It was like higher on emotionality on both dimensions. But for everyone who had just answered the questions about the police, so they kind of knew, oh, I'm going to study about my attitudes about police. Now, warrior was way more negative and way less positive. So in other words, the meaning of the term warrior is a little different when you've been thinking about the police, and for at least our participants on average, it was a little more negative. Okay, so that's good. That kind of pops up the intuition. Police, warriors, maybe that's more negative. And then we looked at which metaphor did you choose as better, what represents how the police are today, the guardian or the and we looked at your responses on that attitudes towards policing scale, and what we found was a very large difference. So in green, you can see that the higher you are on this graph on the y-axis is your attitudes towards police, so higher is more positive. And then in green was guardian, the 60% who said police are guardians, they had a much more positive attitude towards police than the people who said the police are warriors. So, okay, let me say.
Today question.
Today question, yes. And so let me summarize this. Basically, we support the intuition of the authors of the Obama Task Force report, right? So people view warriors more negatively than guardians, especially in that context of your thinking about police. And people who believe that the police today, all guardians, have more positive attitudes towards the police than those who believe they're metaphorical warriors. So this supports these intuitions. So that's good. So our intuitions, they were correct. But they could, I want to say, they couldn't have been wrong. Right? We needed to, at least for me, I needed to measure. And we used this method with other metaphors. So we did a study, a little bit of a different experiment on how people think about the economy and how they react to issues of immigration. And we found that people who, we asked, is the economy like a pie where everyone's fighting for their slice and it's kind of limited? Or is the economy like a wild forest where the more biodiversity, the more everything thrives? And the people who said, oh, the economy is like a pie, they scored higher on this measure of zero-sum thinking, which is basically people's general belief that everything is a limited resource. So I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. So your general thinking about zero-sum predicted basically which metaphor you chose. So we've used this method a few times. One other thing I wanted to do with this was, okay, well, the Obama Task Force was about law enforcement. They asked, the police should adopt this metaphor. So I tried many years ago now. I emailed and I called some police departments and I asked if they wanted to do this study. And whenever I told them what it was about, they said, nope, not participating. And finally, I did this like a self-defense training seminar with this NYPD New York Police Department officer who he worked in a very difficult part of town and he did these like violent crime stuff. And telling him about this, he looked at me like I was an alien. He was like, "We are warriors." Yeah. He didn't want to. So, okay, my work doesn't have as much influence as I wish, but I thought that was cool. Okay. So that was one method. That's one method. I'm going to switch and talk about a different method now, because I don't think there's one right way to do this. I think there's lots of ways we can explore this, and we've tried to do that in our research. So the next idea is more directly inspired by personality psychology, and I was always very jealous of my friends in graduate school who did personality psychology research, because their studies, they worked every time. It didn't matter what the results were. They published it. They just gave people these questionnaires and they correlated to something new. And it was all about the big five personality measure. And at worst, they just argued against the people who said, no, there's six dimensions of personality. They got in these fights. But it was more like a dance where they thought it was fun. Anyway, but I love their studies were so cool and everything replicated and worked perfectly and it was great. And so we wanted to try to use some of their methods, and we actually got help from a personality psychologist with this next step. So this was actually inspired by looking at metaphors for teaching and for the teacher-student relationship. So I've done some lecturing on how to be an effective college teacher. Maybe after this talk, you don't think I should do that, but I did that. And since I like metaphors, I often thought, what kind of teacher am I, or what kind, how can we think about the different kinds of teaching? Because teaching is so abstract. It's like, you need to use metaphors. And we looked, my colleagues and I, in particular, this research is done with Bryan Martin Bard, who's a professor of psychology at Duke University. We looked at the teaching literature. So this was research. These references here are mostly from people in education, and they talk about metaphor. So there's all these different metaphors that they used and looked at and tried to say which one is better for which kind of students and all this kind of. And so there's like the sculptor and clay. So this is like the professor, it's a sculptor who modeled the students, and I carve my knowledge into you. Then there's like the coach for the athlete. So now you're doing the work and I'm just coaching you. Come on, you can do it. And let's go to the problem set. And then this was a new one, the app store and the smartphone user. So if you're like the student comes to class and the professor is like the app store, and they choose which app do I want? And they go to, sociology if they want the sociology app in their brain, and psychology if they want the psychology app. I don't like this metaphors. Then there's the gardener and the plant, very common. You plant the seeds of knowledge and you nurture young minds. There's the tour guide and the tourist. I met a lot of professors who say that. I'm teaching intro to psychology to 500 students, and I'm just giving them a tour of the field, right? Just if you go, I want to do this tomorrow, I go into Mexico City and I go to tour guide and I say, here's this church and here's this sculpture and here's this, and it's entertaining, it's fun. And then there was like the captain and the sailor, we're all on the same ship, and the professor's the captain, but the students need to, I don't know how to sail, man the rigging. So one thing we wanted to do was just first ask people, like students or former students, do you like these metaphors? Like, are these actually useful? And so we just asked them. We ran a study where we looked at 110 current or former college students in the United States and Canada, and we just gave them the 6 metaphors, and we were like, which one is your favorite? And then tell us why. And so of these students or former students, they liked the gardener one the most. And when we asked why, they extend the metaphor. So this is what we gave them. A teacher is like a gardener and students are plants. And we asked, why do you like that? And they would say, because, the professors, they nurture us and they plant the seeds of knowledge. They would naturally extend the metaphor. So the gardener and the coach and the tour guide and the sculptor, those were the most popular. The mean there is like their mean ranking out of the 6, where 6 is like the best. So you can see these ones were usually in the top 2 or 3. And then what we wanted to know is, okay, I think this metaphor means, but what do you think it means? And we tried to adopt this personality psychology method. So here's what we did. We took a new set of participants. We gave them one metaphor. We said, okay, here's this metaphor for college teaching. the teacher is a gardener, and the students are plants. And it's kind of like asking, okay, think about your friend, Sonia. Think about her and her on all these personality variables. Kind, going, whatever. So we can think about this teacher. This teacher is a gardener and their students are plants. Think about that person. And now we gave them 43 statements that we got from those other articles that were by education researchers who were like, these are the properties of teachers. And we also just made up some. And so it was things like teachers encourage teamwork. And it's always college teachers. So that's very specific. This could be very different if we were talking about, teachers in kindergarten or younger kids. Teachers have clear expectations for students. Teachers are confident. So they rated each statement, right? Does that item fit the meta? So, and you can ask yourself, so if the teacher is a gardener and the students are plants, does that teacher encourage teamwork? And you just rate it on 1 to 7, right? And by the way, we might find nothing on this. We didn't know. We just wanted to see how people would rate it. We also like how much responsibility under this metaphor, teachers are gardeners, students are plants, how much responsibility does the teacher have for the learning of the student? How much responsibilities does the student have? And how much power does the teacher have? And how much power does the student have to shape their learning and development? And then we did what personality psychologists do. So we took the ratings for those attributes for all the participants. They were, each person rated just one of the metaphors. And we did what's called exploratory factor analysis. This is where we actually got help from a real personality psychologist who knows these statistics. And so basically you're looking at which items are correlated, right? So like in personality psychology, I say someone really social, if I rate Sonia, oh, she's really social and she's really outgoing. So those are two different words in English, but they're correlated. They mean something similar. There's something underlying it that's similar. And in personality psychology, it would be called extroversion. That's the trait. So we're trying to do that. What are the traits that underlie the properties of teachers, and what are the traits associated with different kinds of teachers, different metaphorical teachers? That's the idea. So you find these latent factors, and each analysis you do tells you, there's 10 factors, and you choose, that's why there's debates in personality. Are there 5 factors, or there's 6, or there's 3, or there's 10, because people have different cutoffs. And then what we do is what people did when they originally did the personality stuff. You iterate this process. So I get the factors, and then you look, okay, sometimes one of the items that we use, item meaning like a statement, teachers encourage teamwork. Sometimes that people's responses on that lower, they correlate with multiple factors. So when that happens, we say that's not a distinguishing trait. Also, if there's a skewed distribution, and everyone says yes, teachers, no matter what metaphor you're thinking of, it's a 7 out of 7. If it's a really skewed distribution, that doesn't help you either. So we throw those out. And you do this a few times, and in the end, it worked out. We did not we had 20 items that we kept, and 5 factors, and there were 4 items uniquely associated with each factor. It really worked out well. And I put in quotes here what we called the factors. And so these are factors of all teachers, right? So this is like, I measure a bunch of people who have different personalities, but when I do that factor analysis, I get factors that different people score kind of along each, but the same factors apply to everyone. That's the idea. It's a direct analogy with personality psych. And so here,
by all teachers, you mean the teachers in all the metaphors?
Yes.
Okay.
The 4 different metaphors. So here are the factors, the nurture, and these are the 4 statements. So your score nurturing, if you rate high on sensitive to students' needs, adapt teaching to different students' needs, care about students' well-being, and get to know their students. You score high on the authority figure if you command respect, establish classroom rules, are authority figures, and have clear expectations for students. If this seems intuitive and obvious, it should, because this is, again, similar to personality psychology. If you're sociable and you like talking to strangers and you're outgoing and you have a lot of friends, then you score high on extrovert. That's just what that means. Same thing here. So community builder was encourage students to support each other, encourage teamwork, encourage students to get to know one another, encourage a sense of community. Engaging communicator is communicate clearly, confident, personable, hold students' attention. And the stimulator is you provoke debate, classroom discussion, stimulates student thinking, questions students' ideas. And so the way we did this, you can see there the amount of variance this explained, meaning in essence, having that factor of nurture explains 20% of the variability in people's ratings across the 4 metrics. That makes sense. What's more interesting is our graph, which is really complicated, but let me just say, so we have these factors, and now we have the 4 conditions, each person got one of the 4 metaphors, and we have their scores on each of these 4 items for each of the 5 factors. You add that together, and now I know when, if I ask you, think about the teacher who's a gardener, think about the teacher who's a tour guide, I can now measure how high or low on the nurturing scale, the nurturing factor. It's like how extroverted you are, how conscientious you are. And what we did was we did this with our original study, and then we replicated it. We ran another 600 people or so in the experiment, just using the 20 items that came out of this study, not the full 43. And we get very high consistency across the 2 experiments. I'm going to show you a very complicated graph that might be hard to see, but I'll explain it. So on the y-axis is your standardized score on the factor. So the higher you are, the more you have that trait. The x-axis is the 5 traits, the 5 teacher traits. And then the different colors are the different metaphors. And again, it all kind of seems pretty intuitive. So the gardener, if you look in the green, and the different shades are the different experiments, but they're very similar. So people who are thinking about a teacher who's a gardener, that's someone who's very high on nurturing, low on authority figure, and slightly lower, but a little towards neutral on like engaging communicator and stimulating and kind of neutral on community building. On the other hand, the coach is very high on authority, a little lower on nurturing, very high on community building, and it might fit your image of like a sports coach in the classroom. Tour guide, low on nurturing, a little bit higher on authority, and definitely the highest on communicating. And that makes sense. When you go on a tour in a city or something or in a museum, you want your tour guide to be really good at communicating. And then the sculptor is kind of highest, relatively speaking, on the stimulating. They provoke debate, and that was kind of unintuitive to us, but that's what happened. And they're a little bit more on the authority. I'm going to skip the next couple slides, but we have in the interest of time, but we have the ratings on responsibility and power, and it kind of mirrors this. But this is the most interesting because basically we tried to show that this tools of personality psychology can use to map metaphors. So now when we think about like, how do I understand, if someone says like in the classroom, I nurture my students, I plant the seeds of knowledge. We have this principle of kind of measuring their like teacher personality that we think is a little bit more like a personality psychology, a little bit more robust. It's kind of based on looking at how everyone's thinking and reacting to these things and figuring out the underlying structure of that metaphorical concept. So that was the kind of idea we had with this project. So I'm skipping a couple of slides ahead here. So people endorse a variety of different metaphors. So like if you ask what students like, you get different responses. In a project that's ongoing, we're asking this, a lot of this was derailed by the pandemic, but we're asking college professors at a bunch of different colleges, which metaphor best describes you? So what kind of teacher are you? Of course, professors, we're very annoying, and we say things like, gardener, but I'm also the coach, so the data is a little messy, but you made people choose. And the cool part of what we thought was cool in this study is these metaphors bring to mind these distinct, coherent kind of clusters of attributes that are the entailments of the metaphor. So we found what we thought was a principled way to measure that. We were measuring the entailments that people are activating. And you can understand the entailments using this latent factors, the nurturer, community builder. And it's the same method that other psychologists use to understand personality structure, the structure of people's personality. And we have since found, we have another paper that came out last year, somewhat comparable, but slightly different factors when we say, okay, instead of thinking about the teacher, So we say like teachers are, professors are gardeners, students are plants. Think about the student. What does that imply about the student? In that case, you don't get this. We thought, we're going to get the same 5 factors. No, we got something kind of different. And the factor analysis didn't work there. It's a little messy. You could read the paper, but well, we find these 6 factors, and we're currently, again, following up with that in some new studies. Yeah. But we think this is like a good, maybe a general kind of systematic method for kind of determining these metaphorical entailments that just go beyond a little bit. Just, oh yeah, you're a gardener, yeah, you're nurturing. Because some of what we got was not so obvious. That, for example, the sculptor, if you go back, sorry to people who get your slides at home, but if you go back, like, I think that the sculptor was someone who would be the highest on kind of provoking debate. That didn't occur to me. I thought the sculptor was going to be the highest on the figure. They were the second highest, but the coach was significantly higher. And that was interesting, and that made us think, because the sculptor had a little bit more of a negative connotation, is what we think. And the coach is a little bit more positive, and it's almost like people like if the coach is kind of yelling at them, authoritatively, because they also are a community builders. So if you're in a community and there's community, then the community can kind of be more, telling you what to do. In other words, there's good authority and there's kind of bad authority. So we know it's just kind of going. This was not what we expected. So again, some of this needs the intuition. It's like, oh yeah, gardeners, that's more nurturing. There's also interesting things we're looking at with respect to stereotypes about gender, for example. So people are more likely to expect that if a teacher describes themselves as a gardener, they're more likely to say that's a woman than a man. This is stereotypes in the United States about who's likely to be nurturing. Although when you ask people, is a college professor a man or woman, most people just say man. So there's still gender stereotypes. Okay. So last study I want to talk about, and I'm sorry if I'm going over time. Is that okay, or do you want me to stop?
No. You can finish in 15 minutes.
Yeah, for a second. So far what we've been looking at, what I've been talking about, are these what I call kind of more deliberate metaphors. That's a word that this researcher in Europe, Gerard Steen, uses, where someone's using a metaphor and it's clear they're doing it deliberately, right? Police officers are warriors of the community. Or the teacher is a gardener and students are plants. But where we started, the Lakoff and Johnson work is all about these conventional metaphors that are just built into the language. And maybe that's a little different. So maybe Lakoff and Johnson might say, well, I don't know what they would say, but they might, okay, you're using that are very obviously a metaphor. You're saying I'm a teacher who's a gardener. That's just different from arguments over, because that's just how English works. So can we figure out a method for looking at if the conventional metaphors in a language also are reflecting how people are thinking, without just exclusively looking at the language itself? So we've done this well, and what we've done is this metaphor for emotion in English. It's a common metaphor in other languages as well, for reasons I'll say in a second. But basically, higher up in space is more positive, more happy. So we say things like, things are looking good, I'm flying high. That means I'm in a good mood, things are positive, I'm feeling happy. Or we say, he's down in the dumps, very depressed. The word depression is a spatial metaphor, which we push down. We say her spirit sank, let's give her a lift. And then after that boost, things are looking up. So up is good, down is bad. And Lakoff and Johnson talk about this in their book. And they point out that this is associated with our embodied experience. So when people are happy, maybe they're not literally jumping for joy, but they're up, they're smiling, their face goes out, everything's up. But when you're sad, you're drooping, you're looking down, it's hard to get out of bed. So there's an embodied association where lower to the ground is kind of sadder, negative. Higher means you're walking around, you're feeling good. So the question is, are people really thinking about emotional valence, this positivity or negativity, in terms of space? Are they actually using, in a way, their spatial knowledge in the moment to think about and conceptualize
emotion. I mean, that was what Lakoff and Johnson said. They said, we use it now when we're thinking about emotion, that's this abstract thing. It's grounded in our embodied experience and our kind of mental representations of space. So do these metaphors actually reflect kind of our underlying patterns of thought, or do people mentally represent emotional balance in terms of vertical space? And a lot of people have done really cool experiments that say, yes, they do. And so, for example, Casasanto and Dijkstra did this study where they had people recall memories that were either positive or negative, and they were like moving marbles. It was a weird contraption. They like picked up marbles and they were either moving them up or moving them down. And you're basically faster to like retrieve a happy memory when you were moving things upwards than when you were moving things down. And then another study by Myron Robinson, they had people look at words that appeared either on the top of the screen, computer screen, or the bottom, and they had to say, is the word positive or negative? So like the word hero, that's positive. And people were faster to respond to hero and say it's positive, but it's on the top of the screen than the bottom. So the idea is that there's this kind of implicit kind of interference or facilitation happening when the spatial dimension in the real world is mapped correctly onto the emotional valence of the activity you're doing, either identifying the word or retrieving the positive or negative memory. And then in another experiment by Lynott and Coventry, they had happy and sad faces that either appeared on the top or bottom of the screen, and you had to say, is the face happy or sad? And people were faster to say a face is happy when it appeared on the top of the screen than when it appeared on the bottom. So I can show you an example of that. They used front view faces, faces looking at you. In our studies, a lot of the times, not in everyone, but in the ones I'm going to talk about, we use side view faces. So here's this face that just comes from this like standardized set of faces, like Europeans smiling and sad and all this stuff. So here's a happy face, and the idea is you're faster to say it's happy when it's at the top of the screen than when it's at the bottom. But we're really interested in this metaphor of looking up, like things are looking up. Because here's a face that's not at the top or bottom of the screen, it's in the middle of the screen, and it's looking up, but it's not at the top or the bottom. And so what we want to know is, are you faster to respond to a happy face that's oriented like this, looking up, literally looking up, than one that's looking down? And the opposite for sad faces, right? So are people faster to respond to emotional faces when they're gazing towards the kind of valence, metaphor, congruent region of space? All right, so how do we do this? We did a bunch of experiments. I'll just show you one. So people just did this, and we said, respond as quickly and accurately as you can. Is the face happy or sad? And then we put a face on the screen, and they press one button if it's happy and one button if it's sad, and then it disappears. And then another face, happy or sad. One thing you should know is there's lots of research. People are a lot faster and more accurate when the face is upright than when it's rotated at all. But we wanted to know if there's an interaction between the rotation and the expression, the positive or negative. So we did this a lot. We had faces in all of these different orientations. So kind of intermediate, upright, looking down, looking up, happy and sad faces. There were 10 faces of male faces, 10 female faces. And basically, if you multiply that, there's 200 trials. So these were just undergraduate participants that come to our research lab. They're sitting there doing this for 20 minutes. And then we had two conditions, not that important, but in one, the face was just on the screen until they responded. So they had the cross for half a second, and then the face comes on, and it's just there until they respond. And then another condition, because we were kind of interested, well, what if they only see the face really quickly? Like, oh, if we do find an effect, is it early in the kind of processing of the face, or is it later? So what we did was we showed the face for just a tenth of a second, 100 milliseconds, and then it was masked with a scrambled face. And so basically they only glimpsed the face for a split second. And so we did that. There were no differences in the, when you look at it, once there were more errors in the mask condition, but overall the behavior was very similar in the two conditions. So the next slide, the graph I'm showing you is the reaction time, the average reaction time for all of those participants, all the 80 participants in the experiment. And so here's what I want to point out. If you look in the kind of red color, or pink color, should have shown the color was easier. What you see is for the happy faces, it's a symmetrical curve, pretty much. So your fastest, here on the y-axis is your reaction time, so lower means faster. We replicate the finding from 50 years that you're fastest to respond to the face that's upright, and the more it's rotated away from upright, the slower you get. But for the happy faces, you're just as fast as to respond when it's looking down as when it's looking up. But for the sad faces, you are significantly slowed down when the face is looking upwards. So our whole fact, the difference in responding between the happy and sad faces is also the fact that people were significantly slower. They had much slower reaction times when sad faces were looking up, then when sad faces were looking down, and then when happy faces were looking up. Whatever comparison you want to do both in our paper. If you look at the accuracy, so this is just the trials they got correct. But if you look at the accuracy, on the right is the unmasked condition. People were overall just slightly worse at the happy faces, which itself is a little weird. Usually you find the opposite, that's fine. But in the masked condition, there were more errors. But again, the big effect was that the most errors were for sad faces looking up. In other words, when sad faces are looking up, people tend to perceive them automatically as happy. That's what we find. So it's cool if I say, like, do people represent, this metaphor of looking up is happy? Do people represent, actually think about the emotion in a face using that spatial representation or spatial cue? The answer is yes, but like not fully. So yes, like people represent emotional balance in terms of vertical space, but it's because people respond slower and less accurately to sad faces gazing upwards. It's a metaphor of incongruency for just sad faces. There was no fact. It's not like happy faces were perceived as sadder when they were looking down. Not at all. The happy faces, the orientation did not matter. Only for the sad faces. So this is a case where does the metaphor reflect how we think? And the answer is kind of. It's true, apparently, that if a face is looking up like this, that you perceive it as happy. But if a face is looking down, you don't perceive it as sad automatically, at least for these profile faces. So, and we do this also where we just have people rate how happy does the face look. So now it's an explicit judgment, not implicit. We get the same effect. But it's probably what we think that this has to do with is the fact that we use these profile faces. So other experiments just on how people respond to emotional faces show that when you're processing an emotional expression that's looking at you, if it's what's called an approach-oriented emotion, like happiness invites approaching, you're faster to respond when that face is looking at you than when it's like looking to the side like this, or the face is slightly tilted. And it's not just positive emotions. Negative emotions, like anger, is an approach emotion. You see an angry face, that's actually in primates inviting some kind of conflict. So angry faces, you also are faster to respond when they're looking at you when they're than when they're diverted. But for avoidance-oriented emotions like sadness and fear, you're actually slightly more accurate to respond in general when they're looking away than when they're looking towards you. And so since we use those profile faces, we find this kind of metaphor incongruency effect only for the avoidance-oriented emotion. And so our conclusion, what I want to take home from all this is really the last slide, is that we try to develop these kind of more principled empirical methods of mapping metaphorical entailments. So if you're looking at what you think is a conceptual metaphor, you're looking at language, okay, this metaphor, some people like this metaphor. If you want to assess, are people really thinking in terms of that metaphor, and what are the actual entailments, or what's the structure of that metaphor, you can use one of these methods. If they endorse the metaphor, that should predict other associated beliefs and attitudes. If you think there's a structure to the metaphor, like the personality structure, like with the teaching metaphors, then use some of those psychometric methods that personality psychologists use. If you're looking at these conventional metaphors that are built into language, try to use an implicit measure. And sometimes you find that, people are thinking in terms of the metaphor. There's a lot of research from a graduate advisor, Lara Borgetsky, who I hear is coming to talk. She'll probably talk about some of this stuff on time-space metaphors, very similar to emotion-space metaphors, that people really are thinking of time in terms of space, just like they're thinking of emotion in terms of space, but maybe not always. There's not always a full connection between the metaphor in language and the metaphor in thought. And so do metaphors like mean what we intuitively think they mean? I think it's good, like, yes, for the most part, it's pretty simple, but not always. And using these kinds of methods can be illuminating. So we want to investigate how metaphors kind of reflect people's thinking. And as I'll say tomorrow, how they shape people's thinking. I think it's good to start with this kind of study where you assess and measure these metaphorical routines. Okay, so gracias por escuchar. I hope this metaphor has been food for thought. I hope this is the metaphor that was expanded and that it wasn't too hard to digest with claims that were hard to swallow, big ideas, because those can leave a bad taste in everybody's mouth. And thank you to all my many collaborators and students over the years. Not always people were involved in these experiments from today, but these are people who I've worked with many times over the years and are instrumental in all my research. So thank you. Gracias.
Thank you so much. Sí, yeah, question.
Discusión, architects, board.
We have enough work right now.
True.
Sí, yo puedo decir algo. Sí. So I'm just wondering to what extent you think we can conclude. So it seems that if the face is sad looking up, we know that it takes more time. That seems to be in accordance with what we expect. If we think the metaphor influences our concepts and our thought.
Yes.
Then what are your thoughts on the case when it doesn't? So happy looking down doesn't seem to be in accordance with that metaphor. So what do you like? What are your thoughts? I have my own.
Okay.
I can share them, but I would like to hear what you think. I mean, what can we say about the how much metaphor permeates in the thought when we have this?
Yes. Yeah. So that's a really good question. I might give you an annoying answer, which is I think it depends on context. So I think our effect, a lot of it is driven by the fact that for most of our experiments, we use those profile faces. So in one experiment, we use front view faces, and actually, if you read the paper, like, you'll see it's my face. And we can use. I had to take these pictures because the first experiment we tried was people looking. And what we did is we said, okay, smile. It was me and some other professors. So I was like, smile, and then looking at you, and then it was like, oh, look up, like this. And it was really good and look down like this. And I believe we got the effect with the happy faces also, and the sad faces, and neutral faces, which people thought just looked kind of sad. But that experiment's kind of flawed because no one goes like this. Like, it was just really weird stimuli. So that's why we switched to the profile, so it's easy to orient them up or down. But the reason I bring this up is because I think a lot of it matters on the context. So let me give you another example. Something like my little nephew, okay, he's shorter than me. He's always down for me. And he's a little precocious, you know this word? Like, he's a little dumb, right? And so when he wants to like pull a prank on me or something, he smiles and he goes like, it's like, and we might call it in English like a devilish grin. So he's like, and I know he's looking down, but I know because of the context. Oh, he's smiling. He just put like toothpaste in my sandwich or something like that, you know. So in that context, I think our minds are really flexible, and we can kind of adapt quickly to whatever that new real world city is. So like, I think we're guided by this vertical on this happy down is sad metaphor. It's a very general metaphor. I can come up with an experiment to kind of test this. But for whatever reason, I think in people's, like, most of the people's experiences, like happy face in America, like happy face is what we put on, right? We like to be happy, even though we have a big mental health crisis. Like, the cultural value is you are smiling, you're happy, you go to Starbucks, and they're like, hey, can I take your order? It's very different, you know. I have relatives in London, and you go to their cafe, they're happy to serve you, they're not happy with them. So I think in the United States, which is where we run the study, right? Everything's happy. Wherever you're looking is happy, that's fine. But sad That's like, we have less experience with that. And I think that for whatever reason, the representation potentially of sadness is never sad people looking. Does that make sense? Like, so I think like in our experience, I think even though the metaphor comes from the more universal embodied, original embodied experience, sad, happy, in people's daily life, like happy is everywhere, we're always happy, but sad, this is, and there's much rarer a representation of sad being. So I think people just looking up, that's happy, because everything's happy, but sad is just that. That kind of makes sense. I want to know your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I agree with the sad part. I just, so what I thought immediately, it was interesting because I thought it before seeing the results. When I saw the happy face looking down,
Yeah.
because I'm rearing a child, like a small child, I immediately, it's like I filled in the body of somebody like looking down being happy.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, something really often in our culture. So for me, so this is the second layer of the question, that like it's how much are we going to rely on this empirical? Like there's so much interpretation going on. I mean, of course, I really like it in the sense that we're discovering different layers of how these things play out. And definitely, I agree that we need empirical evidence, but there's this difficulty of like, there are all these, for instance, exceptions, right? Like this seems to support on the one hand the metaphor, on the other hand, no. So like, I don't know, like, is it, how do you see it? Like, do we need to strengthen these? I guess we need to strengthen this with other studies that, and robustly make these claims.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, maybe one way to approach it is to look more at people's actual experiences. So I think some of these metaphors that are conventional metaphors in language, Lakoff and Johnson have done a great job of showing how they emerge in embodied experience. So, you know, happy is up and sad is down. That's just like how we, and they do this for a lot of their metaphors, the orientational ones, the spatial ones too, time, you know, why for most, but not all cultures is like the future in front of you. Well, it's because, you know, you walk forward and 5 minutes have passed and you're more forward. You know, then the Aymara, this one group, the future, and a couple others, the future is behind them. Why in the past is in front of them? Well, why there's a good explanation? Well, yeah, I can see the past in my mind and my memories, just like I can see what's in front. You know, so you can construct these explanations. But I think I like how some researchers like Daniel Casasato pointed this out, which is basically people integrate all their personal experiences from their culture, their language, and their embodied experience. And all of those kind of get integrated in each person to shape the kind of metaphorical concept that they're using. And you can bring people into an experiment, and you know, in half an hour you can temporarily change which metaphor they're using. So in other words, we could probably train people in a study, you know, sad faces are always looking up in the study. And after an hour, now they won't show this effect that we just showed. Right? This might reflect the average of their experience before they came to the study. But I could change that, at least temporarily, by changing their experience in the experiment. So I think people's minds are pretty dynamic. I think they drift towards the linguistic and cultural kind of metaphor, like that's dominates the culture. So future's ahead, past is behind. But I can put you in an experiment and train you. Oh, the past is front. And for a little while, you look at the past is front, and I can change your reaction time in the study or how you answer a question. A week later, you'll probably drift back, you know, to the stable cultural model that you have. But I think people integrate a lot of experience. So, and that's why I think the empirical evidence is useful, because I think if you only look at the linguistic evidence or people's intuitions, all you're getting a picture of is the average model, right? But when you actually measure the behavior, you get something a little bit more idiosyncratic to the people's experience, which might differ from, you know, the metaphors are very old, thousands of years old, and lots of very ancient languages and cultures. And You know, the experiences have changed. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's useful. I also think, you know, one thing that pulling back out, so some of the more complicated, like deliberate metaphors, war metaphor for X. One of the things that Paul Timoney and I have talked about is how the meanings of the metaphors change over time because people react differently based on what's going on. So I'll talk about a study tomorrow, so a little spoiler alert preview, where we showed that like talking about climate change as a war makes people feel it's more urgent. But when I've been asked by like journalists, oh, so you think governments should use that metaphor? I say, no, don't use it. It's actually not that good. Because if you use that metaphor over and over and over again, it's ineffective. Just like a war, like the United States had a war with Afghanistan, at the beginning in 2003, 2004, 80% of the public, yeah, we got it on. By the time they did the disastrous kind of withdrawal from Afghanistan last year, everyone hated it. Everyone, didn't matter your politics. Because no one likes wars that last a long time. And no one likes wars where there's no clear winner or loser, right? So, and then you're there and you're like, well, who's the winner, who's the loser? Unfortunately, my country has a very bad history over the last 50 years of doing that. Like, let's spend one more time, let's go to war, and then there's no clear winner or loser, and then we leave, and it's not good. A lot of people get it. So same thing with like climate change. The war metaphor, as I'll talk about tomorrow, it gives you the sense of urgency, and in a little experiment, I can make you feel for 5 minutes that this is a more serious issue, but in the long term, that is it's not an effective metaphor. I think the same thing happened with COVID-19. Where when Governor Cuomo, I remember when he gave this press conference, you know, he would come on TV every day on TV in New York and tell us about what was happening and this many deaths, but this is what we're going to do and this is all the PPE we're getting and all that. And it was like, oh, this is good. It's like war. And I remember, you know, after a couple of months, we were all like, well, wait a second. Is this a war we can't really win this war? This metaphor doesn't really work. And very quickly it became very ineffective. So thinking about the change over time, I think is also.
I have one question.
Sí, yeah.
Do you think to make this experiment with other measures, for example, A-track? Because I was thinking in visual perception experiment that you rotate, it's very difficult, and I don't know the name. I say in Spanish, the sacadas.
Yes, okay, yeah, same thing.
Can make more difficult to see how it rotates the face.
I think
it can explain that difference.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. So yeah, so you look at different features of the face when you're identifying the emotion expression, right? And so one explanation that's maybe not as metaphorical is like what you're saying, that just when it's rotated up, you tend to saccade to parts that hurt you in identifying the sad face. I think that's a great question. My previous university did not have an eye tracker. My new one does, and I just have to run out and get a student who wants to help me run the study. But I think that's a great idea. Yeah, great question. Good measure.
Also, I have one question. When you put the words that they related with warrior and guardian, you know, you put the frequency because it makes so difficult, because in one part of the study are 82. But the other one is the example. The terms was exclusive, or they can repeat the different terms?
They can use, for the two questions?
Yeah.
They can use whichever one they want for each. But they have to choose one for each one. So which one actual police, is it guardians or warriors? And then ideal guardians or warriors. So and they have to choose one, but they could choose whichever one they wanted for either one. Yeah. Good. Thank you. See,
so I heard you say that in a previous lecture that metaphors are not magic bullets of persuasion.
Yeah.
And that's a metaphor on metaphor. So I was wondering if it's interesting to you to see these types of how you frame a metaphor in an experiment about metaphors. Like, for example, if you were to conduct an experiment in which you said metaphors are bullets of persuasion, they are like the field or the environment of thought or something like that. Would that change? Would that be different in what you would expect person to be?
That is a really, really interesting question. Metaphors for metaphor. I've used them all the time and I haven't reflected on them all. Yeah, that's really interesting. I would need to think about it. So tomorrow I'll talk about how metaphors are not bullets of persuasion, but are useful for persuasion. They're like let me try to extend the metaphor. It's like a slingshot, of persuasion. So it stings a little, moves you, but not too much, doesn't kill you. But I know that one of the most popular critiques of Lakoff and Johnson was by Steven Pinker. And he loves metaphor, and he's like, yeah, they did this great work, and they documented the metaphors, but he doesn't think people actually think using metaphors. And he accuses Lakoff of using the metaphor for thinking, if this makes sense. So he said, when Lakoff says you're thinking metaphorically, he's adopting the metaphor. But for Steven Pinker, thoughts are something else. It's a computational process. It's mentalese, it's whatever. He uses basically what I call the language metaphor of thought, right? He thinks there's a language of thought, but he doesn't like the metaphor of thought. So that's the one thing that now I want to run an experiment where I want to see, because let's give people different metaphors for what a metaphor is like. Yeah, that's really good. Thank you for that. I need to think about it.
And I have another question.
Yeah.
Metaphors are not the same as analogies, right? So you have given us like these three methodological approaches. So would that be true also to analogies? Or?
Yeah. So metaphors are not analogies linguistically, right? Conceptually, I push them together. My undergraduate advisor was Deborah Gettner, who's the big name in analogy research. And so the way she talks about it is that any comparison between two things, conceptually, not linguistic, so we're talking about thoughts. Any comparison between two things is a metaphor, but for her, an analogy is when the metaphor is, the comparison is in terms of what we call the relational structure rather than the surface features. So the surface feature is like, the sun is like an orange. El sol es una naranja. Okay? Because what's the same is the shape and the color. So that's a metaphor, but not an analogy. Even for if you say the sun is like an orange, even though that's a simile, we say, the teacher, in literature class would say that's an analogy. She'd say, no, it's more metaphor. For her, the analogy is like the examples I use. So most of the examples I use in my studies are what I would call and what she would call analogy, but I call analogies too, but what I also call them metaphors. So it's a little confusing, but I guess the analogy is where the sometimes in some of my research I call them systemic metaphors. So systemic comparisons where what's being mapped, which is a metaphor. What's being compared is the kind of structure and relationships between the parts, not the surface features of the parts. So when I say, there's a war on COVID-19, I'm using this structural or systemic metaphor, or we might say it's an analogy, where it's not, I guess a doctor is literally killing the virus, but not directly like a soldier kills an enemy soldier. It's, they take care of you and they're doing this stuff and eventually the virus goes away or something. So
And a lot of these metaphors are like that. Although, you know, police are that's less analogy and more of the surface level. You know, winter has these attributes: tough, violent, aggressive. So that one's a little more less analogy, more metaphor. That makes sense. And one of the things I'll mention this tomorrow at the end. One of the things we really now are trying to do is, and we've done this in some work, is metaphor. Like how much is the metaphor relying on the systemic structure, the more analogy side of it, and how much it is more just the properties or attributes? And does that make a difference in its effectiveness in framing or in explaining a difficult concept? And so we say it does, but I don't have to. See.
I have a question. You said that when one of the participants is asked why they, I don't know this.
Yes.
Is asked why they chose a metaphor. What they do is they'll why they chose a metaphor. They don't have a clear explanation. This is interesting for me because in science, a lot of metaphors are used. And they are not exactly true.
Yeah.
It's like we talk about energy in terms of current. That's true.
Water.
So my question is, do you think that this explanation that people give in order to explain why they choose a metaphor is an evidence of the knowledge they have, or of true knowledge, or just about knowledge in a specific context? Because I think this is a problem specifically for philosophy of science.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a very deep question. I think in our studies, I don't want to be rude to my participants, but I don't think they care that much. Meaning, you know, we pay them a couple dollars and they're doing the experiment, and we try to make sure they're paying attention, and good participants, and you know, some of them are very nice and they'll leave like a review, you know, this is an experiment, you got, you know, do this experiment. But I don't think they're thinking too hard about it. So I think kind of what's happening in that experiment, like the teaching metaphor one. So these were all people who were 30 years old or younger. They've all been at least to college for a couple of years, university for a couple of years. They had college professors. I think they did the study and we said, you know, which one do you think is best? And my guess is they were just like, no, it sounds good. And then when we asked them to explain why, I think one of the reasons they extend the metaphor is because now they're using it to think about the professor. It sounds good and I'm nurturing. So yeah, I want a professor who nurtures me and is kind and nice, just like a gardener, nice to their friends. So I don't think they're thinking that this is absolutely true, right? I don't think they're committed to it. And I think if I were there and I was asking, like if I asked you, you know, do you want your professor to be a gardener or a coach or a tour guide? You might give me an answer. You might say gardener, and I might say, okay, you know, don't you want a professor who's really pushing you hard and making you better and training you like a coach? And then you might say, yeah, okay, I want that too. And so I think people are pretty flexible in these experiments. I wonder in science if it's a little bit more, I don't want to say serious, but it's a little bit more, we know these aren't literally true, but we want the metaphors to be very useful and productive. So if you look at, I know Sergio and Natalia have written a little bit about the metaphors Darwin used to explain evolution, right? And I know I read one article by another researcher who said like he struggled to come up with the metaphor of natural selection for evolution because he wanted to figure out a good metaphor that would help people understand. And so he wanted it to be a very effective metaphor that would help people get this idea, which at the time was very, very radical and very different from what people believed was the truth, which was animals existed ever since they had been created, and that was it. They never changed. And so I think he tried out, do you know, Sergio, did he try other metaphors, or he considered other ones?
Well, I think considered.
Yeah, so and I think in science, it's more like that, where you're trying to make the mapping, right? You're going from, he's thinking about evolution and how it works, and he has this very complex idea, and he's trying to translate that into a metaphor to help explain it. And I think maybe in other parts of science it's a little different. So like the Rutherford Bohr model of the atom as the solar system was like taken to be true. That's like the origin of the electron is not really true. Electrons don't orbit in that way. It's like I don't know, like a cloud of probabilities or something, or a different metaphor. But there's a real effort in science to try to make the metaphor kind of true, like sort of true. And I think with maybe metaphors for teaching or even metaphors for the police, maybe it's like that, but maybe it's more, I don't know. Now I've confused myself with talking, because now maybe it is kind of the same. I don't know. It's a really good question. I need to think about it. I want to talk to you more about it. Post my talk tomorrow, and I'll think about it tonight, and maybe I'll have a better answer. Sorry, that was confusing.
I have a question. Well, I am not sure how to formulate it, but exactly the question, but is basically I think of metaphors as not having a meaning by itself, like Antonio said, but more like being dynamic and dynamic processes.
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking of metaphoring or some sort of something that suggests that metaphors mean something as a complex in as you say, the interaction that is changing.
Yeah.
But if you think this way, then yeah, I would say the sort of experiment you are doing would give you a very restricted meaning of this process of metaphoring. For example, in the case of evolution, Darwin Darwin used a lot of different metaphors, not only one, a lot, but they were systematically related with different, I mean, they were really related. I mean, and with the metaphor that worked is more famous, the one in natural selection, but certainly the metaphors are systematically related in different contexts. So, in a way, the kind of well, maybe the question is, to what extent would you have something to say about this metaphoring, about this process of dynamic process of metaphoring?
Yeah.
That I would say is central to understand what metaphor is.
That's a very good question. So you're right. So going back to the idea of metaphors for metaphors, I've been using a very rigid one, I think, right? This is the meaning of the metaphor. This is what people are thinking. It's just a metaphor. Don't take me literally, because I agree with you. I think it is a more dynamic process. And I think what I really think about what we're capturing in these studies is maybe a snapshot in time or a very high level, you know, this metaphor is more in this direction than this one. But don't lock this in as this means X and this means Y. And I agree with you that the meanings of these metaphors emerge from the interactions and the way they're used, right? And so one way to think about what I was saying earlier about, you know, war metaphors for climate change and COVID-19 is that the meaning of those metaphors emerge from the dynamics in which they're used and repeated and reused, and that is a process that changes over time. And there can be stable equilibria, right? Like for a while, the meaning, we all can coordinate around, this is kind of the meaning. I think that's what happened at the beginning of COVID-19, where the war metaphor was in some ways effective at getting people to buy in and sacrifice and do this. I think very quickly, really good critiques of those metaphors came about. So my friend Elena Saminu was one of the kind of lead linguists in the UK, and she very quickly was like, nah, this one isn't the right kind of metaphor. And she,
Wildfire.
yes, she likes the wildfire. I agree with you, like, and the meaning is negotiated, I think, through the discourse. That's one way to think about it.
But your experiments are not saying something about this negotiated.
They're not. And that's why in recent work, I'm starting to collaborate with people like Elena and talking more to like just discourse linguists who study discourse, because I'm interested in the broader social processes as well. So we're really capturing snapshots, I guess, of how people are thinking in a particular moment, in a particular context. And I think that's useful data, especially when you learn something interesting about how people are thinking that you did not intuit. And especially when you can show how a message can, and this is the focus of tomorrow, how it can influence people, and you can try to figure out why is the metaphor influencing people in the way it is. And then I think, like you're saying, the next step or a complementary piece is to zoom out and look at how these meanings are negotiated and dynamic and emerge from those interactions over time. And then maybe, that gets back to that point about science, and you're raising this too, because the metaphors that catch on and are more or less effective in science come about. And I think this is what we were talking about yesterday, what you bring about, that it emerges from the process of using it in the course of science and in the course of explaining concepts.
Yeah, just one thing is that about I mentioned Senino. I was thinking actually in relation with the for example, you talk of the metaphor, the war and these guardians and warriors. But it led me to think that in the case, for example, of COVID, this connection wouldn't make much sense. I mean, but it makes sense that the metaphor of there's a change in the metaphor of war for the metaphor of firefighters and fire.
Yeah.
But it doesn't. I mean, depending on the context, one metaphor can be can shift to another one, or can be interpreted in certain ways, say warriors and. But not in the other. No?
I think I understand. Yeah. So
I say the metaphor of firefighters and fire would not work with
like police.
With police.
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that some metaphors, like the war metaphor, applies to any situation where there's us them. Where there's two sides that have differing interests. So that's why it applies to arguments, climate change, politics, right? It's the structure of the metaphor is easy for us to map onto almost any domain that could be viewed as two opposite sides with competing interests. Now, what's beautiful about Lakoff and Johnson's idea is they point out it doesn't have to be that, like, arguments don't have to be war. And I agree with them. And I think one thing that they point out that maybe it's also implicit in what you're saying is that the more we use it, the easier it is to keep using. So the war metaphor is really common and popular and familiar. I think it's common in Spanish. It's really common in English in the United States, And so the more common it is, the more it's used. The more frequently it's used, it continually reinforces. And so it becomes the default. Whereas firefighting, it's a novel metaphor. Novel metaphors have some good properties. They capture your attention, they make you think a little bit, and that can make it more memorable. But because it's so unfamiliar, maybe you're less likely to use it. It's harder to do the mapping. People don't know as much about wildfires and how they're dealt with, so you have to provide a little bit more explanation. Whereas war immediately activates all of this salient kind of schematic. So yeah, it's a good point. So if that's where, and that's why I'm interested in the discourse process inside of it. And that's what I'm, tomorrow I'm talking about the framing side, how politicians and journalists and scientists, how we communicate about these topics, I think does matter, because the more we reinforce one metaphor or another, then the easier it becomes for people to use. In other words, the meaning gets negotiated and settled upon, at least temporarily.
And on the other hand, public policy should be interested in the extent to which, for example, you can change one metaphor for the other.
Yeah. But one of the things I'll talk about tomorrow is it's hard. And if someone doesn't like your metaphor, it can backfire. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So sometimes
One question.
Oh,
But I can read it.
yeah.
So German Salazar says up down is good for metaphoric thought, but left right is not, at least in reference to valence.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that spatial asymmetry?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Daniel Camposanto has some interesting research actually on the left, right, and valence. And people don't use linguistically the metaphor of like, as much left, right, and valence. It does exist. So sinistre, right? That's left-handed. So I'm left-handed. Sinister means evil, right? And there is in, I guess, ancient Greek and a little bit remnant in English and maybe Spanish, like in the Romance languages, there is that left is bad and right is good, right? You want to be on the right side of the debates. It gets messy because then you mix the politics as the same metaphor. That metaphor emerged much later. So left, right, for left is liberal, progressive, right is conservative. That, as far as I know, came out of the French Parliament after the French Revolution, where the progressives sat on the left side. And then, so that came much later, and it, depending on your politics, is either congruent or incongruent with that. And then Daniel Camposanto did this interesting studies where he had people respond with how much they liked different things that are on the left and right of the screen. And basically what he finds is if you're right-handed, you prefer things on the right side of the screen. Things to the right are good, and things to the left are bad. But if you're left-handed, the opposite. So now you prefer things on the left. You think the left is good and the right is bad. And his argument is because you interact more dominantly with one side. So for me, it's easier to pick up the pen and do stuff with it on the left than on the right. So I just learned the association. And then he shows, again, like I was saying, you can change this. You can bring in right-handed people and you put an oven mitt on their hand, or I think that's what he did. And now you have them, I can't do stuff with, or I can't do stuff with my right hand, and now the left is a little bit better, relatively. So to answer the question, we do have the left-right valence metaphor, but it's more, it turns out to be more relative to our body's actual ability to interact with space, and is not as cashed out in the language, although it is a little. But I think the dominant left-right metaphor became the politics metaphor, and that's the one, back to this, that's used so often. People on the right say this, people on the left say this. And so that's, I think, then since half the population is on each side, you get the opposite. Good question. Yeah.
Yes, I'm thinking about how to harness this emotional component of metaphoric framing.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, have you explored these types of adventure games in which you have to choose some path, and it's not just like how you act, but actually acting on that game, right? Like,
interesting.
There's like a slight difference, I believe, in asking someone what would you do and making that, or inviting that process.
Yeah, looking at the actual behavior.
And to put that on maybe philosophy of science terms, would you, for example, give someone or try to make a metaphoric framing and then ask someone to, for example, yes, theorize an experiment about something. Because, for example, you tell someone that a stem cell is a property of intrinsic to the cell, for example, and you use some kind of metaphor for that. Or you said a stem cell is a property that is dependent on the environment of the cell. If you frame that, people would, I believe, make different types of methodologies to explore that, right?
Yeah.
But it's similar to what I'm saying in the case of adventure games. Have you explored that?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So, will it actually influence people's like decisions and what they choose to do in the real world, and not just how they respond to stuff? Kira asked me something similar. In a nice way, she was like, measure real behavior. That's a good question. The answer is I want to. You know, I think it's very difficult to do so. And I think and it's expensive, you know, research is expensive. And so but I think it's a really good question. And I would like to figure out ways to do it. And I think actually thinking for something meaningful, like people's actual voting on a real policy, not what they say in my experiment on the internet for $1 for 2 minutes of their time, right? What will they actually do? So that's what I want. That's one of the directions I'd like to take the research. I told Kira about one study that I'm currently designing. Top secret, everybody. So it doesn't get this one, but I'll tell you. So we have that's okay. So we have some new data. I have data with Professor Hal Hirschfield. He's a social psychologist, but he's in a business school. And he studies time, how people think about time. He has a new great business book. I'll advertise that for all of you. I forget what it's called, but it's actually good. So he studies, you know, how people invest their money and how do you make people more likely to save for retirement. And he actually wants to measure real behavior. And so they've done studies where they like bring people and they show like your face, you're very young. Do you want to save for retirement? And you're like, nah, that's so long. And then you'll show other people, take their face and it'll make it look old. This is you when you're 70. Do you want to retire? And okay, I'll save some money. And so he studies in the lab, and then he's run some actual experiments in the field to actually change how much money people are saving. So that's kind of what you're interested in. Like, can you get people to actually really change their whole decision-making and process? And so he's found that with some, I guess, ways of framing, it's not metaphors, but just how you communicate to people about retirement and the imagery you show them and things like that. So one of the things we talked about together, we were in graduate school together and we've been friends. So we've always been looking for a way to do research together. It's fun to collaborate. And so in English, and Kira says in Spanish too, we have the metaphor of time is money. I guess tiempo es dinero. And so the most common version of that, I mean, there's a lot of, you know, how are you gonna, you know, this wasted my time and I'm out of time and I ran out of whatever. The most common way people talk about using time in English is spending. Spend time, right? How are you gonna spend your time? You gotta spend it wisely, spend your time, spend. But there's another word that's used as part of the metaphor, invest. How are you gonna invest your time, right? You spend money and you invest. But if I ask you, what do you spend your money on? You might say like, oh, food, entertainment, going out with my friends, but that's spending money, right? If I ask you, what do you invest your money in? Then you might say something more important. Oh, I invest my money in, you know, my retirement or saving up for school, you know, something more important. So we kind of feel like invest is more important. So far we ran one experiment like this, like not really. But we basically said, you have this 24 hours a day, and how people got it. What would you spend your money? Actually, a third, because we also need to divide. What would you spend your money on? Or sorry, how would you spend your time? How would you divide your time? Or how would you invest your time? And we gave them categories. And basically, people who got spend were ranked
things like entertainment higher than people who got invest. And people who got invest ranked things like taking care of themselves or seeing their family. I think that's what it is. So what we thought was, oh, those are like more important things, but like, you know, our daily lives, you know, if you have a limited amount of time, like it's hard to be like, I'm going to go to the dentist, right? Take care of my teeth. Like no one wants to do that. But if I ask you, we say, you know, you invest your time, then that kind of taking care of yourself. Okay, invest. So we found a little event, but it's not what you want real behavior. So what we're going to do, and honestly, if someone wants to steal this finance, it's going to be really hard. We want to partner with someone who does like a time management, and we want them to basically send for their customers notifications that are like, how are you going to spend your time today? Spend your time. And we want to send the other one, how are you going to invest your time? And our hypothesis, but we don't know, we'll see, is if you give them the invest, then they're more likely to schedule, oh, I got to call my mom, I got to schedule the doctor, you know, or I got to, you know, do my skincare regime that takes a long time or whatever. You know, stuff that people, that's more invest. So that's what I want to do. We haven't done it, but I hope to. So we'll hopefully come back in a year or two and I'll tell you the results. Probably my default for every experiment is nothing, no difference. The framing won't work. That's always my null hypothesis. So I'm not confident that I'll find it. But I think it's if you come up with the right metaphors, I really do think, like in the history of science, the good ones that are effective stick. And they work. So once Darwin had natural selection, that helped him convince more people that his idea was true in some sense. And I think once Rutherford, Dedrick has written about how once Rutherford and I guess Bohr had this idea that the atom is the solar system, once chemists and physicists used that, they were able to do more physics. They were doing more chemistry. They filled in the periodic table because that metaphor helped them understand the molecules better. And so I think the same is hopefully true in this realm of like decision making and policy. But I think it's hard, it's complicated. And I'm still learning. So maybe 10 years I'll kind of
it would be maybe in teaching, for example.
Yeah.
A good way of this kind of experiment. I mean,
yeah,
the teacher communicate with the students, for example, or for example, teaching art or teaching drawing, for example, which might be.
Well, that's
the metaphor that you use in teaching, for example, music or drawing are sophisticated,
right?
Because it's not easy to teach something like that.
Yeah, and they're not like I'm not good at. I study this. Sometimes people study things because they're not good at it. You know, I had a professor in graduate school who studied memory, and he always said, I have a terrible memory, so that's why I study it. So I understand. So as sophisticated as Darwin and others, all these amazing metaphors, and I'll read some literature, and I'm like, how did they come up with this? It's amazing. So I agree with you. I think we need to do that. I will say one other study, actually with Elena Spino and another linguist, Alison Mackey. And what we were interested in is metaphors for vaccines. Vaccines, very important the last few years. A lot of controversy. A lot of people don't want to take vaccines. And so we ran this big study where there's all these uses of metaphors in vaccination discourse. And we tested whether they would make people basically have more positive attitudes and more certain accurate beliefs about vaccines. And we found that they worked, the metaphors worked. They did not work. This is a new paper. It's about to be accepted. They keep telling us, do this one more change. The metaphors were, so we give people this measure at the beginning of the study of like their attitudes towards vaccines. And then they read all these metaphors for literal kind of control paragraphs, and then they take the attitudes of vaccines measure again. Everyone actually improved their attitudes. Also, most of the people we measured already had good attitudes, because that's who was in our subject pool. But the metaphors weren't more helpful than the literal paragraphs that had just as much explanation, but no extended metaphor. But we also asked people, to this point about effectiveness in teaching, we said, how would you explain to your friend, how does a vaccine work, or, you know, blah, 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 all these other questions about vaccines. And the people who got the metaphor use much more language to describe. We let them write as much as they want. And the people who got the metaphors talked more. And their explanations were more likely to reuse the metaphor. And so our argument in the paper is, you know, sometimes a metaphor can be effective, not because I can measure it on a simple attitude scale, but because now, when you have to communicate to someone else, you're going to have a more elaborate kind of communication that's structured by the metaphor. That starts to get this kind of idea that it's like,
I think in science that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's something we're going to follow up on. So our idea behind this is another thing was there's a lot of interest in public health, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, but climate communications, health communications about we actually need to change people's behavior, not just their response to a scale. And so we're trying to figure out, can we build up to that by first doing these very detailed empirical assessments of these different metaphors and refining them. Because right now, health communicators or climate activists just come up with the metaphor and use it without really testing it, without measuring it. And it may work, it may backfire. And so we want to figure that out. And then hopefully, I think like happens in the history of science, the good metaphors, here I'll use it's natural selection of a good metaphor, right? The good ones evolve when they stick. But in some of these very polarized